Have you ever wondered if the stories we hold most sacred might have, well, deeper forgotten layers? What if the foundational narrative of a people wasn't quite what it seemed? Maybe a surprising twist of history shaped their very identity. Today, we're doing a deep dive into some really fascinating and definitely provocative insights from Sigmund Freud's 1939 work, Moses and Monotheism. This isn't just history. It's psychoanalysis applied to history.
Exactly. And our mission here is pretty clear. We're going to pull out the key ideas from Freud's arguments, which are, let's be honest, often controversial. We'll look at the evidence he uses and try to get our heads around not just what he was saying, but why it might matter, for how we think about collective memory, identity, the power of belief.
Yeah, promises some real aha moments.
Definitely. It could flip some things on their head.
Okay, so let's dive right in. Freud starts with this really bold claim. Moses, the liberator, the lawgiver for the Jewish people, might not have been Jewish at all. An Egyptian, he suggests. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
How does he even begin to argue something so radical?
Well, he starts, maybe surprisingly, with the name itself, Moses. He points to linguistic work, like from the Judisches lexicon, arguing the usual biblical meaning, he that was drawn out of the water. That's just folk etymology.
Folk etymology, so like a story made up later to fit the narrative.
Kinda, yeah. They argue the Hebrew form, Moshe, actually means the drawer out, which doesn't fit the story of him being drawn out. Then Freud brings in historians like Breasted, who point out that Moses is basically just the Egyptian word mos, meaning child.
Just child.
Yeah. Often it was short for longer names like Amen-Mos, child of Amen, or Panos, child of Ta. That finals, by the way, is Greek, not in the Hebrew. So for Freud, that name isn't just a label, it's the first clue. Maybe this figure was, well, Egyptian.
Okay, that's interesting about the name. But even if the name is Egyptian, why didn't historians just say, okay, maybe he was Egyptian? Like, we assume someone named Chamisso is French, or Disraeli has Italian Jewish roots.
Right, and this is where Freud puts on his psychoanalyst hat. He talks about the exposure myth. He brings up Otto Rank's work on hero myths. You know the pattern. Hero's birth is difficult. Oracle predicts danger. He's abandoned, often in water.
Like Romulus and Remus. Or Sargon.
Exactly. Sargon, Cyrus, Romulus. They're left in a basket or something, saved by animals or core folk, then later find out they're actually royalty. Now, Rank's idea was that in these stories, the family that adopts the hero, the humble one, that's usually the real family, the noble family that supposedly abandoned him is fiction, made up to make the hero seem grander.
Okay, makes sense. Glorifying humble origins.
But Freud flips it for Moses. He says, this myth seems designed to do the opposite, to turn an Egyptian, probably a noble one, given the myth pattern, into a Jew. So maybe the Jewish family in the story, the humble one, is the later invention.
Wow, so the myth is hiding, not revealing, his origins.
That's Freud's interpretation. He figures historians resisted this because, well, partly awe of biblical tradition, but also maybe it just seemed monstrous to think of Moses as anything but Hebrew. It hits right at the core of identity.
Okay, so if we follow Freud's logic, if Moses was an Egyptian, how could he possibly give the Jewish people a religion that seems so completely different from Egyptian beliefs? I mean, the contrast is stark.
It is, absolutely, which makes Freud's next step fascinating. Let's quickly paint a picture of traditional Egyptian religion. It's this bewildering mass of deities, right? Gods for everything: sky, earth, sun, moon, abstract concepts like Ma'at, justice, figures like Bes. Many look like animals, and it's all steeped in magic, rituals, amulets.
And the afterlife. Osiris, god of the dead, hugely important.
Hugely. And they love making images, statues, carvings of their gods everywhere. Now, compare that to early Jewish religion. Strict monotheism. One God, unseen. A total ban on making images of anything living. Magic and sorcery. Condemned. And this is really key for Freud. Early on, there seems to be an entire relinquishing of belief in an afterlife, in immortality.
Okay, yeah, night and day almost.
Right.
So how does Freud bridge that gap? If Moses brought an Egyptian religion, how could it look like that?
This is where he brings in what he calls the strange fact of the Aten religion. He talks about Pharaoh Amenhotep V, who renamed himself Akhenaten around 1375 BC. This guy tried to force a new religion on Egypt.
The Aten religion.
Right, and Freud describes it as strict monotheism, the first attempt of its kind in the history of the world. And it was revolutionary. It even brought religious intolerance, something pretty alien to the ancient world before then. Its key features, really striking, phrases like, "O thou only God, there is no other God than thou." Big emphasis on being the only God. It rejected myths, magic, sorcery.
And the imagery.
Aten, the sun god, wasn't shown as a person or animal, just a solar disk, with rays ending in hands, and crucially, complete silence about the death god Osiris and the realm of the dead.
Ah, so that's the connection. No afterlife focus.
Exactly. Freud thinks the silence about Osiris was necessary for Akhenaten to fight the popular death cult. Now, Akhenaten's revolution didn't last. He reigned about 17 years, died around 1358 BC, and poof, the ancient religion was stamped out, his memory erased.
But the parallels with Mosaic Judaism.
They're compelling, aren't they? Strict monotheism, no images, or at least not personal ones, rejection of magic, and that shared silence on the afterlife. Freud sees this last point as a first strong argument linking them, and then he adds circumcision.
Right, you mentioned that. Herodotus said it was Egyptian.
Yeah, the father of history noted it. So Freud asks, if Moses gave the Jews circumcision, doesn't that suggest he was Egyptian, bringing an Egyptian custom? And if so, maybe his religion was too specifically the Aten religion?
Okay, so if Moses was an Egyptian noble, a follower of this failed Aten religion, why leave Egypt? Why lead a bunch of Semitic tribes out? What's the motive?
Well, Freud paints a picture. Moses, this noble and distinguished man, maybe even royal, was a dedicated follower of Aten. Then Akhenaten dies, the backlash happens, the old gods come back. Moses' whole world, his beliefs are destroyed. He's effectively lost his country.
So he's disillusioned, an outcast.
Something like that. But he's also ambitious, energetic. So Freud suggests he conceived the plan of founding a new empire, of finding a new people, to give them the religion Egypt rejected. He finds these Semitic tribes in Goshen. And Freud even speculates the Exodus might have been surprisingly peaceful. Maybe Moses still had authority during a chaotic time in Egypt and just led them out. No dramatic pursuit needed initially.
That changes the whole Exodus story. A peaceful departure led by a disillusioned Egyptian noble.
It definitely reframes it. The idea is the core monotheism came from this Egyptian source via Moses.
Okay, but wait a minute. The Bible talks about Moses meeting Jethro, the Midianite priest, marrying his daughter, finding God Yahweh at Mount Horeb, a volcano god. That sounds totally different from an Egyptian Aten follower.
Exactly. This is a major contradiction, and Freud tackles it head-on. He leans on historical research like from Edward Meyer, suggesting there might have actually been two Moses figures that got merged over time.
Two Moses?
Yeah. One is the Egyptian Moses we've been talking about, the Aten guy. The other is a Midianite figure connected to this local deity Javi in the Sinai region, maybe linked to volcanoes. And he's the son-in-law of Jethro. And then there's this other piece of evidence Freud finds crucial from a scholar named Selin.
What did Selin find?
Selin pointed out traces in the book of Hosea and other prophets of an old, suppressed tradition, a tradition that the original founder, Moses, was actually murdered.
Murdered. By his own people.
By his stubborn and refractory people in a rebellion. And his religion was abandoned. Just like Akhenaten's, Freud finds this historically plausible precisely because it's so negative. Why would anyone invent a story about their great founder being killed by his followers? The motive would be to forget it, right?
That makes a grim kind of sense. Okay, so if the Egyptian Moses was killed, his Aten-like religion rejected, how did it ever come back? How did it become Judaism as we know it?
Freud suggests a long, slow process. Centuries later, maybe around Cades, there's a kind of compromise. The descendants of Moses' original followers, he thinks maybe the Levites, who often had Egyptian names and seemed to hold on to Moses' memory, they eventually merged with other tribes who worshipped this Yahweh figure.
The followers of the other Moses, the Midianite one.
Possibly, or just tribes influenced by that Yahweh cult. Now, the Moses people, maybe the Levites, they remembered the Exodus from Egypt. That was their story. But in this merger, that story gets transferred to Yahweh. It gets, embellished, the pillar of smoke and fire, the Red Sea parting, all attributed to Yahweh now, not the original Aten-like God.
So the history gets rewritten, basically.
Or distorted, elaborated. Freud points out the biblical texts we have, the Hexateuch, were compiled much later, weaving together different sources, J, EP, etc. These later editors, especially the priestly source, consciously tried to smooth things over, create a seamless story, deny the gaps and contradictions, merge the two Moses figures, and obscure the Egyptian roots of things like circumcision.
And the Levites. What was their role in this compromise?
Freud sees them as Moses' people, his core group, maybe scribes, loyalists. They survived, kept the memory alive, maybe in secret, maybe just as an undercurrent. In this later compromise at Cades, they were an influential minority. They insisted on bringing back aspects of the original Mosaic teaching. And so very slowly, Yahweh starts to change. This originally rude, narrow-minded local god, over centuries, starts to look more and more like the old god of Moses, like Aten.
How?
Through this persistent underground tradition of the original Mosaic religion, it keeps bubbling up, especially through the prophets. The prophets, Freud argues, were constantly pushing that old message. God doesn't want sacrifice and ritual, he wants belief, truth, justice. Which sounds a lot like the Egyptian idea of Ma'at, cosmic order and righteousness.
So it's like the original idea was suppressed but never fully extinguished and eventually reshaped their religion from within.
That's the core idea, a buried tradition returning.
Wow. Okay, this connection between historical events and buried traditions. Freud then takes it even deeper, right? He draws parallels between this whole story, rejection, latency, return, and how individual minds work, the traumatic neurosis idea.
Exactly. This is where he fully merges his historical speculation with his psychoanalytic theory. He starts with the individual. He talks about traumata early childhood experiences, often sexual or aggressive, maybe between ages 2 and 4, that get completely forgotten. Infantile amnesia, he calls it. But they leave unconscious memory traces.
Things we don't remember, but still affect us.
Precisely. Then there's often a latency period, years where things seem fine, but later, maybe puberty or adulthood, the return of the repressed happens. These forgotten memories resurface, but usually distorted as neurotic symptoms, compulsions, anxieties. And they feel incredibly powerful, absolutely compelling. You have to believe them, even if they seem illogical.
Okay, trauma, latency, return. How does he apply that to all of humanity and religion?
He basically says humanity as a whole went through something similar in its childhood, in prehistory. Primal conflicts, probably sexual and aggressive, which got suppressed, forgotten. But then, much later, these repressed memories came to life again and created collective phenomena that look like neurotic symptoms. And for Freud, those phenomena are religion.
Whoa, so religion is like a collective neurosis rooted in primal trauma. What trauma?
This goes back to his book Totem and Taboo, The Primal Father Murder. He theorizes that early humans lived in small groups, dominated by one powerful male, the father, who kept all the females and drove out or killed the sons.
Sounded brutal.
It's a hypothetical reconstruction, yeah.
Okay.
Eventually, the expelled sons banded together, killed the father, and, this is graphic, consumed his body. Cannibalism as a way to identify with his power.
Okay, that's a lot. So this supposed primal murder is the foundational trauma for all humanity.
In Freud's view, yes, repeated countless times. He argues this event led to the first form of social organization, the brother horde. They realized they couldn't all be the dominant father, so they created rules, renouncing certain instincts, like incest, the first taboo, leading to exogamy, marrying outside the group. This is the beginning of society, of morality.
And religion comes out of this too.
Yes. Totemism, he thinks, was the first religion. They choose an animal, the totem, as a substitute for the murdered father. They revere it, but once a year, they have a totem feast where they ritually kill and eat the totem animal. It's a solemn repetition, a commemoration of the original father murder.
He sees a link to communion there, doesn't he?
A striking one, he notes, the ritual consumption representing the original act. Then, over time, animal gods become human gods, and eventually there's a return to the idea of one powerful father deity, monotheism.
So monotheism itself is a return of the repressed.
That's the core of his argument here. The idea of one great God isn't just a philosophical step, it's a distorted memory trace of that murdered primal father. That's why it feels so compelling, so obsessively true, he says. Like a delusion in an individual, it contains a particle of truth from the repressed past, which gives it its power.
And the murder of Moses fits into this how?
It's a later repetition, he thinks. Another father figure, Moses, being killed by the sons, his followers. This repetition might have even fueled the wish fantasy of the Messiah, the longing for the return of the powerful murdered father figure. For Freud, connecting Moses' murder to the primal scene is vital. It's the link between that forgotten prehistoric event and the emergence of monotheistic religions.
And Christianity.
Freud suggests Paul of Tarsus intuitively grasped this deep, unconscious guilt, the guilt over the father murder, which became original sin. Paul then offered a solution, Christ's death as a sacrifice for that sin. So Christ becomes, in this psychoanalytic view, both a resurrected Moses and a stand-in for the returned primal father, whose death allows humanity to finally feel cleansed of that ancient crime.
It seems like Freud sees this whole complex, the trauma, the repression, the return, as actually shaping the character of the Jewish people, maybe even helping them survive. How does that work?
He argues the Mosaic religion, even in its later evolved form, gave them several key traits. First, the idea being the chosen people. Moses instilled this sense of specialness, boosting their self-confidence, making them feel maybe superior. This helped them maintain their identity, stay separate, united by shared ideas and values, even through hardship.
A kind of psychological resilience.
Perhaps. Second, the ban on images. That prohibition, even stricter than Aten's, forced a shift from relying on senses to valuing abstract ideas. Progress in spirituality, Freud calls it. This boosted self-esteem again and led to a high value placed on intellectual work like studying the Torah, especially after the temple was gone. He thinks this focus on intellect acted as a sort of dike against brutality.
And the third thing?
Instinctual renunciation. The religion demanded self-control, a just life, holding back impulses. Freud compares this to individual psychology. When your ego obeys your superego, your internalized conscience, based on authority figures like the father, you feel a sense of pride, a kind of pleasure. Religion provided the structure for renunciation and the resulting psychological reward.
He mentions circumcision again here, doesn't he?
Yeah, quite provocatively. He calls it a symbolical substitute of castration, signifying submission to the father's authority, a symbolic giving up of certain instinctual, perhaps sexual gratifications linked to that primal power struggle.
This is all incredibly heavy and obviously controversial. But it leads to a really difficult question.
Yeah.
If this is about repressed truths returning, how does Freud explain anti-Semitism, this persistent, often irrational hatred?
Right. He tackles this directly, suggesting several layers of reasons, some obvious, some much deeper, rooted in this unconscious history. The deepest reason, for him, goes back to the father murder. He argues the Jewish people, metaphorically, denied the murder of their father figure, Moses. Christians, however, through the story of Christ's sacrifice, admitted their version of killing God, or the Son of God, standing in for the Father, and in doing so, felt psychologically cleansed.
So the accusation, you killed our God.
Freud flips it. He says it's unconsciously true if interpreted as, you won't admit you murdered God, the primal father archetype, whereas we admit it through Christ and are forgiven. It's a projection of unresolved guilt.
Wow. What are the other, maybe more obvious reasons he gives?
Things like Jews simply being seen as foreigners, even when they've lived somewhere for centuries. Their cultural difference, especially from, say, Nordic peoples, and their sheer persistence, their refusal to disappear despite persecution. He says this makes them unpardonable to some.
And circumcision comes up again.
Yes. He thinks it creates a disagreeable, uncanny impression on others, unconsciously reminding them of castration anxiety and other repressed primal fears they'd rather forget. And one last point. He suggests some peoples were forced into Christianity, badly christened, he calls them, and resented it. They then projected this grudge against the new religion onto its source, Judaism.
So hatred for Judaism can be displaced, hatred for Christianity itself.
That's his argument. He points to National Socialism as a modern example of this dynamic. He's clear, though, that this is just a simple contribution to huge, complex questions. But he hopes it sheds some light on how the Jewish people developed their character and managed to endure for so long.
It's definitely shed light on some incredibly deep and challenging ideas. So after this whole deep dive, origins of monotheism, collective memory, trauma, identity, what's maybe one final thought for us to chew on?
Well, here's something provocative based on Freud's thinking. If our most powerful beliefs, like monotheism, aren't just divine gifts, but maybe the echoes, the return of the repressed from our deepest, forgotten collective traumas, then maybe that feeling of absolute truth they carry has less to do with logic today and more to do with an ancient, obsessive memory buried deep inside us. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, what other parts of our civilization, things that seem inexplicable, might actually be rooted in that collective unconscious past.